that once though, so it's been mentioned. And mostly I'd like to say that I'm really grateful to Connor and Ryan and Brandon and Ashton and Mel Babick, who have done a significant amount of work over the past 6 months to develop 2 project proposals in Taneum Creek that complement each other and are actually within the same reach of stream. So I'll be presenting on both of those today, and I gave Michael a heads up. I'm presenting in the reverse order from what it says in our agenda. So this presentation first focuses on the impacts of dispersed recreation in Taneum Creek, and we'll highlight what we'd like to do under the Taneum Creek R&R project, which I'm pretty sure is an intentional pun. It stands for rehabilitation and recreation, but of course the creek needs a chance to relax and recover from what has been happening in its floodplain. Then the second project is a preliminary design request, and Eric Merton is here to help me with that one. And that is to describe what currently has been proposed for Taneum Campground, and then to identify why we need engineering support to move that project to the next stage. So if it makes sense, maybe in between those two, we do have a scheduled break on the agenda, so we'll see where we are, and I'll consult with Michael about whether we want to take a break right in the middle.
Sounds good.
Okay. I feel like I've learned a lot about Taneum Creek this year. There has been increased focus on Taneum Creek for a little over a decade now, and it feels like it's accelerating. And so I want to just remind folks, and this will come up a few other times in the presentation, but a large part of why we're able to focus on Taneum Creek now is because Kittitas Conservation Trust and the Yakima Nation improved anadromous passage into Taneum Creek back in 2007. And so since that time, we have consistent access for coho. We are seeing steelhead spawning pretty far upstream on the National Forest land. We know that we are also hosting West Slope cutthroat, rainbow trout, and lamprey, and I noticed that Ryan didn't specify the species here. Certainly Western brook, and I don't know if we have any indication that we would see Pacific lamprey this far up. In the lower part of Taneum Creek, there's rearing habitat available for spring chinook and for fluvial bull trout. And looking towards the future, Taneum Creek is predicted to maintain cool temperatures in the face of climate change. And the Yakima Nation has been considering Taneum Creek as an area where bull trout might be introduced. The technical terms are a little interesting for that. We don't have a bull trout population there now. So we would be using a population from another system and introducing them to this creek. Taneum Creek is located to the northwest of Ellensburg. It's a right bank tributary to the Yakima River, and a good portion of the watershed is in public land, a mixture of national forest, L.T. Murray Wildlife Refuge, DNR land owned and managed by the Nature Conservancy, and some land owned by the BLM. And we're really just seeing private land in the lowest reaches of the stream. And sorry, I meant Bureau of Reclamation rather than BLM, those bureaus. The reach of interest for these two projects is between stream miles 7.75 and 11. Right in the middle of that, the sort of teal colored star is a developed campground, the Taneum Campground, operated by the Forest Service on National Forest. Downstream and upstream of that developed campground are dispersed camping areas that are the focus of the R&R proposal. And if folks are not familiar with that term, dispersed recreation or dispersed camping is the way that land managers refer to use of the public land that is not organized. Typically, there would not be an installed toilet there. There would be no specific access or graveled roads, nothing that is defining the way people use the landscape. The work that's proposed this year is following on the footsteps of good work done by the Yakima Nation, Mid-Columbia Fisheries, and other partnering organizations. I mentioned the Bruton diversion, which was key to reestablishing passage in the system. Yakima Nation has been adding wood to Taneum Creek since 2008. And most of us, I think, on this call are familiar with the dramatic positive impacts that that has had on the system. Areas that used to be brown are now green, and that's pretty exciting to see. So our proposal to you now is to further reduce those areas that are brown. I think one of the questions in the earlier presentation was, what do we mean when we say browned out? And this drone photo that Ryan took last week is a really good illustration of what we mean when we say browned out. Because last week is spring, right? Like the soils are still moist, things are growing, flowers are blooming. And if you can see an area like this right along the creek that is dry, dusty soils, lacking their organic layer, heavily compacted, and hosting no vegetation, then you're seeing a browned out area. This is the most downstream of the Taneum R&R work sites, and there's just about 2/3 of an acre of browned out area here at Site 1. Apparently 2/3 of an acre was plenty to host a 400-person rave last week, and the drone footage happened to come right as the cleanup for the rave was starting. So oftentimes I shy away from talking about the trash impacts from recreation in the riparian or the floodplain, because we know they're an aesthetic problem, but sometimes it's hard to make a case for the impact it has on the ecosystem. And that's why I was really excited the other day to talk to a grad student who is looking at the role of microplastics in stream food webs, and told me that she's finding that benthic macroinvertebrates are incorporating the plastics that they find in biofilms into their tissues, and they're making their way through the food web. Okay, it sounds funny that I said excited. It's not good news at all, but it is helpful to understand that when we're seeing trash throughout our riparian and floodplain areas, it's not just a matter of being unsightly, it's also impacting the food webs in our streams. And Taneum Creek at this location by the lowest most work site is a very uniform channel. It's one of those parts of Taneum Creek that suggests that it was probably shaped for the convenience of previous land managers. We don't see any wood in the creek here, and at the high flows that were experienced last week, we're not seeing variability in velocities. Within the floodplain itself, there are areas that might work as a side channel or an overflow channel if they were reconnected with the stream. But that uniform nature of the stream bed has cut the stream down so that it's not connected with these soils. This is a flyover of this area, so we're moving from downstream to up. And Ryan sped it up. The creek wasn't really roaring quite that quickly. But what we really wanted to notice here is, again, how fairly uniform the flow is, and to just kind of visualize how things could be different if that stream was spreading up and out rather than focusing its energy in the channel and cutting down. I forgot I was going to kind of give a warning that there are a few places in these videos that might be intense on your screen. So each time I show a video, I'll give you a heads up on that. Wow, you can actually even see the Ellensburg wind in this video. That's how we know it's authentic. The project partners have developed very detailed designs for these sites. And so at work site 1, we are proposing to install 6 in-stream wood structures to create complexity and to help the stream reactivate the floodplain. We would decompact and apply slash on those browned out soils. And by decompaction, we typically mean taking the bucket of an excavator with teeth, digging down and creating pits and variation in the topography in that area. So there'll be microsites where trees can reestablish, and the entire area will be seeded with native grasses. We don't anticipate doing active planting here. We are going to let the trees grow in from the edges, but we will seed to prevent weeds from establishing. This is a cross section of how we expect that floodplain topography to look after construction work is done. And so there'll be greater activation of the floodplain, particularly when you look here at, here's the stream channel, and currently it would have to go up and over this berm. I don't know if these are the historic berms we see from land management or if this is just a relic of folks driving around in the area. But by regrading, we'll have a greater accessibility of floodplain here. The wood structures that are proposed are similar to those that were installed at Taneum Cedar Meadows last summer and have been installed in the North Fork Teanaway River. They're structures that are not anchored in, but they are ballasted and they are keyed in to the bank around existing vegetation. So they're resistant to flow, but we do expect them to change and to adapt to flow conditions over time. Moving upstream, this site gets the cutest host award, but it's an entire acre of browned out area at stream mile 10.1. So now we've moved on the original overview map from being below this developed Taneum campground to above Taneum campground. This area again is showing that browned out compacted soil in the floodplain. And I think this one illustrates what an impact that can have on riparian condition. If we're standing right here by these fire pits, we're looking over the edge of the bank to the creek. And the narrow riparian here is really not sufficient to provide the shade and filtration functions that we ask for in a riparian zone. Our focus in this site, on site 2, is decompaction of those soils and applying slash to create roughness over them. Finally, site 3, 7 acres of browned out. It's a very large, very extensive site located another half mile upstream from site 2. The creek is flowing at its real velocity here. And as we move, you'll see there are some areas of wood in the creek at this location that are having real positive benefits on stream function. We're proposing to add in more wood, and we think we'll see greater connection with this floodplain once we have it in a restored condition. If the water were to come up and use the floodplain now, it would just accelerate over those compacted, devegetated soils. We wouldn't really see the velocity slowing function that we ask for from a floodplain. There probably wouldn't be opportunity for those soils to recharge. But with the decompaction and the roughness from the slash, and then the greater root strength of native vegetation, that floodplain will be ready to function as the stream is able to use it again. If you see cut ends on any of the wood that we're seeing, then that suggests that it's wood from a previous restoration project. Quite a bit of this is not, so we are seeing natural recruitment, which is exciting. But then there are long stretches like this where we would have the opportunity to reconnect the floodplain if there was some structure in stream. This is just highlighting the proximity to the main Taneum road And then looking back downstream again at the extent of that browned out area. This was also taken last week, so I just think it's really helpful to remind ourselves that although it's been a dry spring, we still wouldn't expect to see things look this dry and dusty in a riparian area if the soil was in any kind of healthy condition. Here we can see the drone operator down there. So here at Site 3 in this large expanse, we are proposing to excavate the side channel inlet to reactivate a swale that currently is not connected. We would again exclude vehicles from the area by placing boulders, and we've done this before. The boulders really can't just be placed, they need to be partially buried and they need to be large enough that they're not easily winched out of the way. We would decompact those soils and incorporate slash for roughness and organics, and we would seed with native seed. In the stream itself, we've proposed to install 13 wood structures to add greater complexity and to start to get that floodplain working. Okay, so we had great questions from Connor's first presentation, and Connor gave me great answers for them. So I'll try not to just read verbatim, but I will focus on what he put together. So at the moment, we don't have alternate camping areas identified, but Mid-Columbia Fisheries, as I mentioned, has done this work before. And we think that having alternate areas identified and in development as the restoration work is occurring is really, really important for public acceptance. When we worked along the Cle Elum River, we were careful to, as much as possible, try to make sure there was a one-to-one exchange for camping opportunity. So there are opportunities for dispersed camping higher in the uplands, and that's preferable from a land management perspective and from a stream protection. Any of us who are campers know that that's not preferable from a recreation perspective in all cases. And so Mid-Columbia Fisheries and Yakima Nation will keep working with DNR and WDFW to look for recreation funding that can help to enhance the dispersed opportunities in other locations. On previous projects, we've let salmon recovery money focus on the restoration of the floodplains, while recreation grants from other sources have focused on improving the accessibility and the infrastructure in areas that are less harmful to the creeks. Okay, so similarly, the thought is, aren't we just going to push people into other dispersed camping areas along the creek by changing this? And Connor pointed out, there are lots of opportunities that aren't along the creek. Along the creek itself, these areas are the ones that are actually easiest to get to. People are not using other areas because there's significant drop-offs from the road, or the floodplain is constrained there, or in some places the floodplain is all wet and marshy and beavery because of previous restoration work. So again, have DNR and DFW committed to opening new replacement campgrounds? No, they're not able to make that commitment without having money to allow them to do that. But we are committed as a project sponsor to supporting them in seeking those funds and to engaging the public in those discussions. Connor pointed out then at this point that what will prevent the areas we're restoring from being damaged again is that the restoration work is extensive and it really makes the floodplain an inhospitable spot to set up a camp. I mentioned that the soil decompaction is really, it's like munching. So the excavator bucket goes in, it takes a clump, turns it up, and you end up having very rough and uneven soils throughout the restored area. We're going to incorporate slash, which is small wood, often left over from a nearby thinning project, that will be sticking up all cattywampus and make it difficult to traverse through that area. And there will be humps and potholes left. Things will be rough, and that'll allow the creek to start to shape it on its own. Also, the land managers have pointed out that many of the people camping here are using RVs. They're not tent camping, and these areas will just absolutely not be accessible to RVs. So we anticipate applying for our permits prior to the end of January of 2022. That'll depend on how things are looking from our funding situation, but our designs are in a place where we could bring them to permitting now. Have we done enough wood already? I think that's the gist of this question. In reaches, yes, there are parts of Tandem Creek now where the Yakima Nation has done previous work, where the stream is functioning very well and is clearly using the wood to good effect. But there are reaches like the ones we've highlighted here that are deficient in wood, and we're seeing the stream's energy cutting down into the channel rather than spreading across the floodplain. Taneum Creek, as you all know, remains a priority in the Steelhead Recovery Plan and in our surfboard tag focus lists. So by highlighting these areas where we're lacking in-stream complexity and floodplain connection is lacking, wood structures are a cost-effective way to reach our outcomes. Elizabeth, you had mentioned concern about the detail in the design report, and I'd like to talk with you further, probably just one-on-one, to understand what we could do to augment that. And then finally, I think the concern with this question was, would we be taking wood from an area that would possibly degrade riparian conditions somewhere else? And no, the wood that would be purchased or acquired would be from upland forest health projects and not from a riparian area. So that concludes the focus on the Taneum R&R portion of the project. And Michael, I'll look for your guidance here. Do you want to pause and take questions on this portion before I go on to the campground?
We have a couple of questions that came from Bob in the chat. So he asks, what impact on water temperatures would you expect from the plan spreading out of the channelized water?
So Bob, we typically do that with the intent that we would see cooling of water later in the season. And that's not always seen because it depends on how effective the landscape is in actually storing water in the floodplain soils and what the timing is of that water contributing back to the creek. But because the water spreading across the soils happens during winter and spring floods, we wouldn't see an impact right then in the channel because the water is already cool at that time. And one of the goals of reconnecting the floodplain is to try and have greater connectivity between the stream and its hyperrheic so that we might have cooler water later in the season. And I'm trying to hedge what I say on that because I know there's active research happening to see to what degree that effect is actually documented. Bob, you also asked, will the reworked areas, which will be inhospitable to motor vehicles, be left hospitable to hikers, fishers on foot, or horses? No, the intent is for them to really be no fun to walk through. Again, on previous work, we have left pedestrian trails to access the creek. I haven't seen that proposed in these locations. Jeanette says, what actions have or could occur between Site 1 and Site 2 and 3? Let me take a look.
Rebecca, I asked that question just because there's that 2-mile gap between, and I understand the implementation of the recreation, rehab, and enhancement. But I'm just asking sort of as the woody debris and the floodplain actions occur at site 2 and 3, what happens below that that supports those actions or could potentially decrease their effectiveness?
Yeah, and Jeanette, I'm not familiar enough with the area to speak to that, unfortunately, but I'll capture that as a question that we can get back to the group. Unless anybody else on the call is familiar with what the creek looks like between that lowest site and Taneum Campground. Okay.
Thanks,
Pat,
because that would have been the same thing I had about the campground. So it'll be helpful to understand, you know, what's going on below these projects. And I understand, I get the fact that site 1 is really a recreation impact and therefore it's lumped into this for efficiency purposes, but it's just relevant to know what occurs below.
Yeah, thank you. If no one else knows, I will volunteer to go walk it for you. Maybe like later this afternoon. Pat, what was your question?
I'll go with you.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, thanks, Becca. Yeah. By the way, I loved your comment about trash impacting the food web. That was great. So I had a question about wood stability, and I guess I looked at the Taneum projects when they very first started, and had some concern about them, and I'm glad to say I was proven wrong. But we, at that time, in terms of the review panel, we're looking at some kind of site characteristics that would identify, how stable the wood is or isn't going to be that's put in. And I guess my observations there, it's been kind of the water busting up wood and moving it to a place where it wants to be, that's really creating the best habitat. So, I guess where I'm going with this is, if one of the things, like Elizabeth mentioned, your design report, if you had some information in there about like bankful width and bankful depth at sites relative to the wood size, then that's something that we could look at and say, we're fitting into these boxes in terms of wood stability categories, and whether they bust up or not doesn't matter. They're going to, stay in the system, and that's something I've always looked for on these projects. And it seems like you're almost there with the data you have.
Okay, great. That's good feedback. Thanks. We'll make sure we add that in.
Question from Kirk. Any chance the grad student work efforts you discussed could be included in PRISM? Super interesting and added value.
Yeah, I'll ask her if she has anything written up. I actually met her and talked to her at Connor's going away party. And I think she's working with Dr. Clea Rango. So I'll ask if there's anything written up yet, and I suspect not quite yet, but then in the future I will share it with this group.
Any other questions on this session? And if not, Becca, I propose that we do a break now and then continue on to the next half after that. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, if that sounds good to you.
Sure, that works well for me. Eric, how long a break? We're taking 15 minutes, Michael?
10 minutes is what we have scheduled. We could do longer though. Yeah, we could do 15.
Oh, either. I just wanted to make sure Eric will still be available to back me up. Does that timing work okay for you, Eric?
Yeah, about 11:15 I need to go.
So we could reconvene at about 10:50. Does that sound good? Do you think you can get through the parts that Eric would need to be on in 20 minutes or 25 minutes?
Let's do 10:45.
Okay, that sounds good. Great, we'll reconvene at 10:45 then.
Thanks, see everyone shortly.
Thanks.